Nothing is true. Everything is permitted. Welcome back to Thursday's Theology. My name is Jeff and I'm your host. And this week we are going to be talking about my favorite video game franchise of all time, and that is Assassin's Creed. Now, when I first started this whole channel, I decided that I wanted to discuss what it is about video games that reflect theology. At least that's what I wanted it to, at least an aspect of it to be. So we are going to talk for the next few weeks about the theology of Assassin's Creed and how some of the creeds of the Assassins and some of the tenets of the Assassins actually do reflect a lot of theology, whether good or bad. So this week we're going to be talking about the bedrock foundational statement of the Assassin's Creed, and that is, nothing is true, everything is permitted. Now, that first part, nothing is true, I actually disagree with that part in terms of theology, because if we look at what Jesus claims about himself throughout the Gospels, we see that Jesus claims that he is the way, the truth, and the life. So that means if we are following Jesus, so anybody who follows Jesus, anybody who claims to be a Christian, also agrees with the fact that Jesus is the truth. So in the Assassin tenet, and we talk about nothing is true, if you're thinking in terms of Christian theology, then that is actually a false statement. That's a false doctrine, because we know that Jesus claims to be the truth with a capital T, the end-all be-all of truth in the world. So the first part of it is kind of hard for me to justify as a theologian and as a pastor and as a video game amateur, I guess. But yeah, that idea of everything, or that nothing is true, is actually kind of a warped idea based on what the Assassins are talking about. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that, because I think that as a Christian, I also have to claim, like I said earlier, I have to claim that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, meaning that Jesus himself embodies the truth, the age-old truth, the cosmic truth, the truth that existed before creation. All of that is in the personage of who Jesus is. So if I am truly following after Christ, I cannot claim that truth is relative. I cannot claim that truth means something for someone but doesn't mean it for another person. Or I can't get behind this idea of nothing is true, because Jesus says, I am the truth. So that being said, I want to make sure that we know that because we are followers of Jesus, because we are following after the teachings of Christ and claiming that Christ is the Son of God, then we also have to come to terms with the fact that there is no relativity in the truth of who Christ is. Christ simply says, I am the truth. So just wanted to clear that up. Now, moving on to the everything is permitted. Nothing is true, everything is permitted. Now, this one was actually a really, really interesting one for me to think about, because it made me think about how during Jesus's time, Jewish culture was extremely restrictive. It was restrictive in the amount of things you could eat, the way you could dress, the way you could talk, who you could interact with. And if you defiled yourself, for instance, let's just use an easy example. So there are clean and unclean animals, and pigs are an unclean animal. So if you were a Jewish man in the first century and you happened to come across a pig, or if you touched a pig, or if you came into contact with any of the meat of a pig, then you would have to go through this whole ceremonial cleansing in order to be reaccepted back into the culture. So you had to go through all this process of, ritual bathing, and then you had to go to a priest in order to be deemed, okay, you are clean, you can enter back into society. And you had to go through all these steps in order to gain your cleanliness back. Jewish culture was extremely restrictive. So again, like I said, things you could eat, things you could do, people you could talk to, etc. All of those were restrictive. So this idea of everything is permitted in the Assassin's Creed made me think of Peter's vision in Acts chapter 10. Now, if you don't know who Peter is one of Jesus's disciples, and he's the one whom Jesus says, you are the rock that I'm going to build the church on. So he's a really, really important figure for us to know about, because he is one of the main disciples. In fact, let me pause and say my favorite moment with Peter is when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's just been betrayed. So Judas has come with the Romans to arrest him, and all this is going down. And Peter, bless his heart, pulls out his sword, lunges at one of the priest's servants, and cuts off dude's ear. So Peter's trying to defend Christ from being arrested. I mean, it's only natural to defend your teacher, to defend your mentor. And then Jesus just like, no, that's not how we're going to do this. You know, whoever lives by the sword is going to die by it. So Jesus picks up the ear, reattaches it, and heals the dude. So Peter is like all gung-ho, like, oh, I'm going to protect you, Christ. He cuts off dude's ear. And then Jesus is like, come on, dude. Like, that's not what's going to happen here. And then Jesus, you know, I like to think of it, Jesus licks the ear and sticks it back on. Just like, okay, you're good. Anyway, that's not the point. So Peter is one of Jesus's disciples, and later on in the book of Acts, the book of Acts comes right after the Gospels, and basically it's the story of the early church. Now, what's going on in Acts 10 is that Peter has this vision where there is a blanket that is lowered from heaven with all animals and all sorts of grains and all sorts of food and stuff like that, and there's a voice that says, come and eat. And Peter's just like, no, I can't. I'm Jewish. I have never eaten unclean food. And the response is, do not call unclean what I have made clean. And the whole point being is that because of Jesus's sacrifice, because of Jesus's fulfillment of the law, Peter is now free to eat and partake in anything that has been created. So he can eat the unclean food. He can interact with the quote unquote unclean people. He can dress more freely. All these old restrictions that were on him are no longer there because of what Jesus has done on the cross. So this idea of tying it back into Assassin's Creed and everything being permitted, it is true that because of Peter's vision in Acts 10, everything is permitted. However, and this is the big however, everything might be permitted, but not all of it is beneficial. And what I mean by that is we talked last season about whether or not Christians should drink. And the idea is that nowhere in the scripture does it say that drinking is prohibited. Nowhere in the Bible does it say, you know, oh, you cannot drink. You cannot have an alcoholic drink. Otherwise, you know, you're going to burn in hell. Nowhere does it say that. However, it condones drunkenness. So the excess of drinking. Same thing with gluttony. Eating is not prohibited in the Bible, but it is the excess, the gluttony, that is prohibited. So the idea of everything being permitted is true in one sense because now we have the freedom to partake in anything in creation. However, not everything is beneficial or should be partaken in. For instance, just because hardcore drugs exist in creation doesn't mean that we should probably be partaking in them. I want to make that very clear because just because everything is permitted because of Peter's vision in Acts 10 doesn't mean that we have free reign to do whatever we want. It gives us the freedom to partake in things that were once deemed unclean, but that does not mean that we should actively pursue anything that is detrimental to our health, detrimental to our psychological makeup, etc., etc. So just because everything is permitted, not everything is beneficial. And it has to do with just moderation, because again, drinking and eating are not prohibited in the Bible. It's the excess of those. So being moderate in what you do, being moderate in what you partake in, or that is what is at the core of this whole idea of everything being permitted. Now, again, I just want to make sure nobody is going to take my words and say like, oh, that means I can do hardcore drugs in moderation. That's not the point, because hardcore drugs are really, really detrimental to your health. Same thing. I mean, I would even say smoking cigarettes. Same exact thing. Oh, I'll only have one or two a day. Like, no, that's still bad for your health. So you should probably not partake in that. But as I was thinking through this whole thing of the Assassin's Creed and how it relates to theology, this core tenet of the Assassin's Creed of nothing is true, everything is permitted, is both true and false. The false part being the nothing is true. The true part with an asterisk, as we've talked about, is that everything is permitted. So yeah, that is my thoughts on how the core tenet of the Assassin's Creed relates to theology. Thank you for joining me this week for Thursday's Theology. My name is Jeff, and I'm your host. And like always, remember, theology doesn't always have to be difficult. It is simply the study of who God is. Take care. We'll see you next week.